My brothers and sisters in the Lord, modern technology at times is often fascinating and very interesting. A few years ago, there was a company that developed an app for the telephone, and the app is called Be My Eyes. Be My Eyes. And the way the app works is that someone who is blind or visually impaired, they download the app on their phone. They register, they allow the app to use the GPS to locate them, and they put in the language that they speak. And those who want to volunteer, who have good eyesight, or at least decent eyesight, they also download the app and put in the same information and register themselves as a volunteer. And the way the app works is that if someone who is blind or visually impaired comes in contact with a situation in which they need someone else's eyes, they hit the app. And the app uses their GPS in order to locate volunteers that are close to their area to connect them with. And when they find a volunteer, the app connects it with someone via video chat, so that the other person can be the eyes of the person who is blind or visually impaired. One example I was reading was a very simple example. There was a lady who was blind, and she was in her kitchen, and she dropped something on the floor, and when she bent down to pick it up, she hit her face on the countertop. And she didn't know how bad it was. She could see that or feel that blood was coming down her nose. So she hit the app. It connected her with someone else on the other end through video chat who was able to look at her face and instruct her about her need in order to get stitches. Be My Eyes, modern technology. My friends, in the gospel today, we have a story of a blind man, Bartimaeus. And in the time of Bartimaeus, they didn't have all that technology. There was no Be My Eyes app. There was no Braille. There was no audio recordings. There were no seeing eye dogs. There were no corneal transplants. And in that particular period of time, if you were born blind and you did not have the support of your family or the support of a community, you basically had only one recourse, and that was to be a beggar. And that's what we see Bartimaeus in the gospel today. He's the blind beggar on the road that's leading out of Jericho. And this blind beggar, my brothers and sisters, has a great encounter with Jesus. Now, there are a few things that we can discern about Bartimaeus. First thing, my brothers and sisters, is this: Bartimaeus is disadvantaged. He's disadvantaged. He has a physical handicap. He is blind. And certainly, my brothers and sisters, that disadvantage causes him to be in the state that he is in the gospel today. And there are many different disadvantages or handicaps that each and every one of us may have in our own life. They don't all have to be physical. And sometimes, my friends, those disadvantages also lead to us being ostracized from the community, from being discarded from the community. And we see that with Bartimaeus. Not only does he have a disadvantage, but also he is discarded from the community. He's an outcast. We see it in his very name. You know what Bartimaeus means? Bartimaeus simply means son of Timaeus. We really don't know what his first name is. And maybe his parents felt he wasn't worth enough to even be given a first name. He's simply the son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus has this disadvantage, this disability. He has this way in which now he is outcast from the community. And he finds himself on the side of the road begging. Now, my brothers and sisters, Bartimaeus represents every single person in this church today. Because all of us, my dear friends, have our disadvantages. All of us have our handicaps. And it may not be physical, maybe it's psychological, maybe it's emotional, maybe it's mental, maybe it's spiritual. Maybe it's broken relationships, broken finances, broken homes. The list could go on and on. Each and every one of us have our disadvantages. And sometimes because of those disadvantages, we may feel that we too are rejected. We too are the outcast. We too are the beggar that's on the side of the road, just like Bartimaeus. And those disadvantages come in all shapes and forms and sizes. I'll tell you one disadvantage I often run into today, especially with younger people. And I'm talking about maybe high school age, college age, and then into their early 20s and maybe even late 30s. And the biggest disadvantage, my brothers and sisters, I find with that group of individuals is that when the going gets tough, they fall apart. They really do. And I'm not making a joke or being fun. I really mean that. For many young people, they have lived a life that has either been so easy, or they lived a life in which they haven't really had to work for anything. Everything's been given to them, that when they face a crisis, when they face something someone else can't fix for them, they fall apart. They don't have the spiritual, the mental, the emotional grit they need to keep on keeping on. And I know, my brothers and sisters, for those who have children, and you say, well, Father, you don't have children. I have a lot of children. Just look at all you people here in this church and all your problems I got to deal with. So when you have children, I know that when you have children, you want to protect them and you want to do everything for them, but that can go to an extreme, to such an extreme that they don't know how to survive in the real world, because in the real world, everything doesn't go our way. It's a disadvantage. You know, the Swedish people have a saying for that. They call those individuals those who slide in on a shrimp sandwich. I have no idea where that comes from, but that's the saying they use. They slid in on a shrimp sandwich. It means everything was given to them, and when the going gets tough, they fall apart. It's just one example, but everyone in this church has a disadvantage, has a handicap of whatever it may be, just like Bartimaeus had. Some of you may remember this. In 1995, I believe it was, a woman by the name of Heather Whitestone won the Miss America contest. She is deaf. And she and her mother were told when she was first born and when she was young that there was really nothing they could do with this little girl. The mother should just send her away to a deaf school out of the way, and maybe she would get a third grade education. Well, the mother and Heather would not go for that, and they worked and they struggled, and Heather became the 1995 Miss America. And after that, there was a poster that was made with her and her crown, and at the bottom it said, "They said I would never have more than a third grade education. I'm glad I didn't listen to them." You see, my brothers and sisters, all of us have a handicap or a disadvantage. But the thing we learn about Bartimaeus is the same thing we see in that example of that young woman, Heather Whitestone, is this. Bartimaeus may have had a disadvantage, but Bartimaeus was determined. He had determination. When he heard that Jesus was coming by, he called out to him in his need, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." He called out to Jesus in his need. He was determined to have that encounter with Jesus. My brothers and sisters, how determined are you and I in that same way? How determined are we to have that encounter with Jesus? The only encounter, my brothers and sisters, that's going to allow us to be renewed and refreshed, the only encounter that's going to heal all hurts and all wounds and allow us, my brothers and sisters, to be the disciple that he calls us to be, that he's destined us to be. Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus. He is determined. It reminds me of a gentleman by the name of Bob Weiland. Bob was in the Vietnam War. He lost both of his legs in the war. When he came home, he would often say, "I may have lost both of my legs, but I didn't lose my heart." And many years later, after coming home from Vietnam, Bob walked across the entire United States, from sea to shining sea. It took him 4 years, and he did it on his hands. in order to raise money for Vietnam veterans. And when he was asked by a reporter, why did you do that? Isn't there an easier way to raise money for veterans than to walk across America on your hands? He said that I wanted to show people that if they have two legs, they need to be able to walk with those legs to Jesus and to his will in their life. They need to come to Jesus in faith. He said, that's why I did it. It wasn't just a fundraiser. My brothers and sisters, that is determination. And we are called to be like Bartimaeus, to be determined, because what happens to Bartimaeus? He cries out to Jesus. They say to him, hush, you're not that important. Don't bother the master. They try to hush him. But Bartimaeus wouldn't have anything to do with it. He calls out even more, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus says, call him. And he asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus responds, I want to see. And what does Jesus say? Go, your faith has saved you. He had faith, my brothers and sisters, that Jesus could heal him. That was the difference between Bartimaeus and the rich young man in the gospel. Remember, the rich young man, he goes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And you know how the story ends. He went away sad because he had many possessions, because he didn't want to leave behind his wealth to follow Jesus. Bartimaeus is different than the man who was blind, who was by the pool of Bethsaida. Because remember, when Jesus asked him why he didn't get into the pool, he had all kind of excuses about when the water was stirred up, this one got ahead of him and that one got ahead of him. Bartimaeus had no excuses. He called out to Jesus. Jesus called for him and he responded. And that's the third thing that we see, my friends. Yes, Bartimaeus was disadvantaged. Yes, he was determined. And what happened to him, what happened, my friends, is what I like to call, he was discipled. He was discipled. Now, normally we use the word disciple as a noun, but it can also be used as a verb. He was discipled. What does it mean to be a disciple? It means to be a follower. He was discipled. He was transformed. He was transfigured. He was renewed. And what does it say? After he was healed, he followed Jesus along the way. You see, my brothers and sisters, he was willing to give up everything in order to have that encounter with Jesus. We notice these very small details the evangelist tells us. The evangelist says Bartimaeus threw aside his cloak when Jesus called. My friends, he was a poor beggar. The cloak was one of the only things that he owned, yet he wasn't worried about that. He wasn't like the rich young man. He threw that aside when Jesus called him. He was discipled. And he recognized, my brothers and sisters, in his heart that not only the scales from his eyes fell away, but the scales in his heart as well. Because I'm sure Bartimaeus felt rejected and disadvantaged, that he wasn't loved, that he wasn't cared for. But you see, my dear friends, because of that encounter with Jesus, he knew. He understood. It wasn't just about a physical healing. There was a complete healing there, and then he followed Jesus on the way. He knew that he was important in the eyes of the Lord. My brothers and sisters, as we come to this altar, do we recognize the same thing? That in our own blindness, with our own blind spots, with our own faults, with our own disadvantages, with our own handicaps, with our own problems, with our own trials, for those things in our life that make us feel depressed or anxious, for the ways that we feel that we're not loved or we're not cared for, we're not appreciated, whatever it may be, do we recognize when we come to this altar, Jesus is saying, come. He's calling us to have an experience with him, to feed on his body and blood, and to be discipled, to be transformed, to be transfigured, and to go out into the world following him along the way. My friends, just like Bartimaeus, we are called that even in the midst of our disadvantages, whatever they look like for us, we must be determined to encounter Jesus so that you and I may be discipled, transformed, to be willing to leave everything, to follow him on the path to eternal life and eternal salvation, to have that kind of trust and that kind of faith. And in doing so, my dear friends, recognizing how precious each and every one of us is in the eyes of our God.